This is Symphony of War, the Nephilim Saga. Do you like the Fire Emblems? Or how about maybe some Shining Force? Actually, maybe I should rephrase that. Do you even remember Shining Force? Maybe some Ogre Battle or Tactics Ogre, a little bit of Longresser, or however you pronounce that. This game is very much in the style of those, although it's an indie interpretation of it. And this is something that we're seeing a bit more of right now because, well, this is a style of game that isn't done very often. And it's also been pretty much exclusively a AAA gaming thing. You haven't really seen very many indie developers actually tackle this sort of thing all that often. So it's cool to see that actually happening more now. And this is one of those. And it does a really good job, in my opinion, of capturing that like old school, like older Fire Emblem feel or older Shining Force, although instead of being focused on singular units like hero style, it is instead focused on squadrons of units. It actually has a pretty involved story as well as some really nice background lore and stuff. There's an entire menu in the camp menu that breaks down all of the lore and history of the world, and it's pretty well done. I think the dialogue is actually quite well written in this case, and the story's nice. It reminds me a little bit of the Final Fantasy Tactics story a little bit, not to like a one-to-one reproduction or anything, but that's just sort of the vibe I'm getting from it. And I actually am pretty invested in the story and characters at this point. I think it's pretty well presented, mostly because there's a very equal standing between like cutscenes, dialogue areas, and actual combat. You know, that's actually one problem that some people have with certain games in this genre, is that they can be very dialogue heavy and have very long gaps in between missions. But in this case, I feel they've done a really good job at the pacing and have made the missions pretty long and fun to go through, but also make the sort of downtime and managing your troops and all that stuff not take so long and be so tedious that it like outnumbers the hours that you get from the actual gameplay. So how it works is, in battle, you will have a large battle map that will consist of various different important places, as well as lots of enemy units, and you can place your own units on the battlefield wherever you want around your starting area. Now, as I mentioned, it does not focus on individual units, but instead of assembling squadrons of multiple troops. So each unit that the one tile on the battlefield represents is actually like at least 3 individual units, oftentimes more than that, sometimes up to 6 or even up to 9. You have spots for up to 9 depending on how much capacity and leadership the leader of that particular squadron actually has. And you simply move your units around on a turn-based, tile-based map, and then you can attack enemy units as you get close to them, and depending on the range, of course, of the units in your squad. And one thing that's a little bit different about the combat already is not just that it's focused on groups of units clashing at once, but also because one round of combat is actually 2 attacks from each side. So you actually can do a lot of damage and completely destroy an entire squadron if you're well-equipped enough. So yeah, every time you enter combat, you will actually trade blows twice on each side, unless you're doing a ranged attack, something that is not in melee range. That will only work once, generally speaking, although sometimes units will get free actions in combat. I don't know exactly what determines this though, but that allows them to act in additional time, even ahead of what they were normally going to act in the first place. And there are, of course, all sorts of different bits of hidden depth to this. For instance, the various units that you have in all of your squadrons do matter. They, of course, have different ranges and attack in different formations. Some units can ambush other units as long as you're the aggressor and not the defender, which means they can basically teleport behind them and attack units in the rear instead of dealing with the front units, which are generally more heavily armored. So if you have like your squishy healers in the back, you don't want to send that squadron against a bunch of assassins or anything, for instance, because they can just totally destroy you. You've also got mounted cavalry units. You can even have mounted healers, which is interesting, although you cannot have mounted spellcasters as far as I know, which I guess there's not really a point to doing that, but it would be really funny. You, of course, have your polearm users, which are good against cavalry, and in fact there are even mounted polearm users that are extra good against enemy cavalry. There are various healers that can support your more beefy guys from behind and keep them alive. There are spellcasters that can throw out all sorts of large amounts of destruction, but take a bit of a turn to actually charge up, so they're very slow. There are even dragons you can recruit and change them into various different elemental forms for specific purposes against certain other troop types. There are even dragon riders you can get much later on that are very powerful, but are very expensive to actually obtain and keep. Of course, there are also tons of different objectives and other features on the map. For instance, you might have a fort that allows ranged units garrisoned inside of it to be very evasive and evade attacks while raining death all around them, so you want to station them with a bunch of ranged units if you can. There's also various capturable points, like say resource mines that can mine you some iron or some gems that allow you to get some resources to help upgrade your troops after the battle. There are also lots of towns and other strategic points that you can actually capture, just clear out the enemies and then capture capture the towns, and they will give you a good sum of gold when you capture them, as well as some faction experience that goes towards your whole faction, your whole army. And they also make for very good strategic sort of choke points, because if you are in the city when it gets attacked, you get a big defensive bonus. So you can actually sort of try to lure the enemy troops, maybe a problematic enemy squadron that is very powerful, to some other very powerful troop of your own that is stationed within a big heavily fortified city, so they'll have a big advantage when they actually meet. There can even be treasure chests in different places along the battlefield, which is always kind of a mean move, because you know what you should be doing, but then there's treasure like halfway on the other side of the world, and you can't just let it sit there, right? You got to go and get it, so you have to dedicate at least one of your squads to treasure chest duty and try and get them around the map as fast as you can and pick up all this treasure before the map ends. Generally, your usual defeat scenario is either to have your main character's formation completely destroyed, or to have the fort or otherwise fortified place that you started the mission from captured by the enemy, because the enemy can also capture areas just like you can. And generally speaking, you win a map by actually defeating the main enemy commander unit and capturing the sort of final, most heavily fortified city on the map as well. And I find that the maps are generally really well laid out to where they're not a chore to play through. I know sometimes these games, depending on how their map design works, the sort of tactical strategy layer can take a very, very long time to actually get through one of these missions, but I find that this game actually goes relatively quickly while still having a lot of depth and a lot of tactics. A lot of maps will have you end them in like 11 to 14 turns as a sort of sub-objective, so that should show you the sort of par time that it should take you, and that makes it seem actually not like such a big deal. You know, you might be able to end it in 7 to 10 rounds or so if you're really good at placement. There can also sometimes be some hidden bits on the battlefield that reminds me a lot of the Shining Force games, where you might encounter a specific unit or a certain character, maybe even a bazaar that you can buy rare things from as long as you're on that map if you just go to a certain place. Like, for instance, there's one map where there's one unmarked fort in a certain area that you can go through, and if you stop on that fort and defeat the enemies at it, you will actually find a baby dragon, and you can have that dragon join your party. And that's really cool, because dragons are normally a very expensive, very rare unit that you will not have actually had access to at this point yet. So it's a way to sort of get a very powerful unit early. And in fact, I was able to use that dragon's squadron so many times during that match that I actually ended the match with it ready to be promoted to an adult dragon, because you can actually do that. And so now I have a really powerful squadron that runs around with a huge dragon in their party. In between battles, you are in a sort of hub area, usually like a fort or whatever you have occupied at this time, and you can do things like go to a marketplace there to recruit new units to make new formations with, or to actually just shore up some of your existing formations, depending, again, on the capacity for new units that you have. It's all determined by the leadership skill value of the whatever unit is selected as the leader of that formation. You can also buy some various artifacts, and every squadron has one artifact slot to start with, and you can equip them with various artifacts that will usually take some of their capacity, but in exchange will give them increased stats. And since it increases the stats of everyone in that formation, it's a really good idea to have some powerful artifacts laying around. And you will occasionally find some unique stuff, like some very powerful and rare artifacts with special names, and even some unique mercenaries to hire. Mercenaries that have their own unique names and their own unique little backstory and their own traits that you can only find on them. So these are very powerful but extremely expensive units that you'll very occasionally come across and be allowed to hire. There is quite an expansive 4-tiered tech tree that you can access when you're in between battles as well, and you get these sort of scrolls from winning battles, and you will just accrue them as you go, and you can spend them on tech tree techs, although there are some technologies on the tree that also take some other things. All of them take scrolls, but some of them will also take like some iron or some gems or some other resources that you may need to get to. And the tech tree stuff tends to be very powerful, so it's a good idea to invest in it as often as you can, because these are generally really big things, like increasing the armor of all light armored units across your entire army all at once, or increasing the maximum health of cavalry units, and even unlocking a second and third artifact slot so that you can kit out your formations with even more stuff. So yeah, the tech tree is a very good place to go for powering yourself up, but you can also promote units, which is a system that I always enjoy, and this is where the sort of ogre battle influence comes in as well. Once you have battled with a unit enough times, it will master its current class, and once it has mastered its class, you can then change that class to a new one if you have the right resources. You'll find the class trees to be very expansive. Like, a lot of classes can change into 5 or 6 other things, and some of them will require just certain stats, like, you know, changing from one to the other requires it to have at least 32 strength, for instance. Some of them will also require special resources, especially things like the magic classes, which will often take some gems to change into, and then you start getting into the more advanced tier 3 classes, stuff like paladins and valkyries and samurai and all sorts of stuff like that, that will take even more of these resources but make them into extremely powerful units with all sorts of really cool attacks and powerful traits and things. So yeah, the unit progression is a very satisfying part of this game. I'm always a fan of like class evolution systems like that, so obviously in this case I really do like the troop management, allowing you to have an army of ever-evolving troops that you just group into formations as they get stronger. There's also a cool little system in the form of these relationship scenes. Whenever you're between battles, you can have the various characters talk to each other, and all of the named characters will actually have scenes with each other, and they can actually become friends this way. If you complete enough of these scenes, they will actually develop relationships, and you will also get a little bit of faction experience to show that your army is growing as a result of these people getting to know each other. And I really like that sort of context, and it makes you more invested in the characters when they're more than just battle units, you know, when they have a lot of stuff to say and ways to interact outside of battle. And you can then form up your different squadrons, get everyone equipped and ready, and evolve to the newest class that you need them to be, and then move on to the next story mission. And as far as I can tell, the story in this game is quite long. I don't know exactly how many chapters it is, but I've heard of people saying that they're having problems with chapter 25, so it's at least 25 missions long, probably longer than that. And it's, yeah, there's a lot of gameplay here. There's probably a good like 30 or 40 hours at least if you know this sort of game inside and out and you're used to this idea. If you've played a lot of Fire Emblem, if you've played a lot of Shining Force, if you've played a lot of Tactics Ogre, then you'll be really at home with this, because it feels like an old school rendition of how a lot of the earlier entries of the series actually played. I think this is a difficult genre to nail down, but I think that this is an excellent rendition of how it should actually feel. And in my opinion, this is an indie version of this sort of genre that has been very successful, where some others in the past have failed at various points or just have not quite gotten there, you know, because it's a tough genre. The whole strategy RPG thing has a lot of moving parts, a lot of things that can go wrong, but I really do find that this game, it's got a nice story, it's got fun characters, the combat is really satisfying. You know, when you just deploy exactly the right tactics and get your units in just the right spot to just like totally decimate the enemy army, it's really cool. And there's even a lot of extra depth to that too, because different characters can have different elemental alignments which will affect their stat growths in various ways. You can have different types of attacks, like attacks that specifically target the leader, aggressive attacks that do more damage but cause you to take more damage. You can even try and force their surrender depending on the morale. There is a morale system that affects every squadron on the battlefield, and if you're able to get them to surrender, you get a good boost of experience for all of your units, as well as a bunch of extra money at the end, because you basically sell them, it seems, everyone who's surrendered. So I think it does a lot right, and if you're a fan of this sort of game, well, there's not a lot of places you can go right now to get it, so I would definitely recommend checking this out. Also, it's only 20 bucks, which is kind of a steal in my opinion for games like this. Maybe it's because I'm used to them costing like 50 and 60 bucks usually, because they're generally a AAA only thing, so to see one at like less than half that price is very refreshing. But I think there's a lot of content here, more than enough to justify that price, and if you're a fan of these sorts of strategy RPGs, then this is a really good one to try. So I will link you in the description below this video to the Steam store page so that you can check it out yourself. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.